Okay, so only keep watching if you've got your head around unit tax and ad valorem. Go back to the previous videos if you have to, okay? Anyway, so for this next video, I just want to check that you're okay with the idea of revenue. If I'm the firm, imagine I'm just one firm and I've sold, let's say, 10 units and I sold them each at £5. Well, how much money have I made? I've obviously made £50, 10 times 5. Well, how would we show that on this diagram? 10 times 5, if I'm timesing the distance from here to here by the distance from here to here, well then in other words, this area here, the area of this rectangle, represents the total revenue made by that firm or by the firms in the market. So we can show revenue changing. If you haven't already practiced this with me or with Mr. Nasser, you can show revenue changing. So if I'm just focusing on the total revenue being spent, let's say supply shifted for whatever reason, this could be the old revenue. If supply shifts to the left, this is the old revenue here, and then this is the new revenue here. We've got this area PEQ0 and this area P1, E1, Q1, 0. And we can practice showing that some more. But first of all, I just want you to make sure you're really, really happy with the idea that the price times the quantity, and therefore that rectangle there will always represent the revenue. Pause if you have to. Okay, so now I want to show the tax revenue that the government earns, because remember, the government, when they add to the cost of production, is taking that money and putting it in their pockets. So they want to know how much money they're going to make from it. So really, really important that we always think about Q1 and P1, because when we look at P and Q and E, that's before the tax was put in place. There is no tax revenue then. But at P1, Q1, now some of that money is tax. How do we work out with the area of that money that is taxed? Because P1, E1, Q1, this rectangle here, is the total amount of money being spent by consumers, but not all of that is going to the producer. How do we work out how much goes to the producer versus how much goes to the government? Well, we have to remember, before we said that the vertical distance, the up and down distance, the vertical distance between the supply curves is how much tax per unit is, the tax per unit. So here it's, say, £1. So that vertical distance between the supply curves at this new quantity, from here to here, I'm drawing this, you don't need to draw it, but just see this dotted line here. That vertical distance is the tax per unit at this quantity. Well, if this whole thing is the total amount being spent, well, just this bit here, from here to here, times this quantity is how much is going to the government. So I'm going to draw an additional, I'm going to use a ruler, obviously. This much here, this rectangle here, is the government revenue received from this tax. The tax per unit times the quantity. So this whole area here. This whole area here. Okay? What's left over here is the amount of money that the supplier actually receives. I might call that revenue if I want. I mean maybe I could just call it I could call it A, I could call it B. It doesn't matter what I call it. Just know that that's how much the producer is actually received. I could call it PR for P rev or something. It's just how much the producer receives. Now that sort of should make sense, because to produce Q1, the original supply curve, that's how much they need to cover their marginal cost to make Q1. So in a sense, it doesn't make a difference to them as long as they're making that much. Well, then they're willing to produce this much. Okay, let's look at the ad valorem for the ad valorem tax, again, this is why it's so important that we do it at Q1, because if we did it at Q, it would be a different size tax. But once the tax has been added and the price goes up, we move to a new equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And at different points, we've got a different tax per unit. At P1, the tax per unit is this vertical distance here. That vertical distance here. So the tax revenue so I could call that producer revenue. I could just call that A. I'm just going to call it A. It's just that as long as you understand that this amount is what's being received by the producer, the price is up here. We're getting the price, take away the tax per unit. So the tax per unit times the quantity. This whole area here represents the government revenue, the tax revenue that they're receiving from this ad valorem tax. So it's pretty much the same thing between the two. Okay, if you need to pause here to check that you understand and re-watch 100 times, do it. Really important that you understand that the revenue is the price times the quantity, and that the tax revenue is the quantity times the difference, the vertical distance between the supply curves, because that's the tax per unit. That's the tax per unit. So the very last thing, if you're sure you're ready to move on, the very last thing is that we can break this up into who is actually paying the burden of this tax. Is it the producer that's losing out on that money, that's losing money from their pocket to go towards this tax, or is it the consumer? Well, actually it's a little bit of both. The producer wants to maximize profits. They want to minimize their costs. They, if possible, would get the consumer to pay all of the tax. Whereas obviously the consumer is utility maximizing. They're willing to pay a bit more if they perceive the value of the good to be high enough, but not all of it. So we can break it up. We can say, okay, unit tax, the same thing again. At Q1, the vertical distance between the two supply curves, here to here to here, this vertical distance represents the additional cost per unit. So times that by that quantity. Well, this whole area here, represents the tax revenue, but who's paying it? So to think about who's paying it, you have to think, well, the price P has gone up to P1. The price that the consumer pays was P, now it's P1. Well, some of the consumers are just not paying it anymore, but of the consumers that are still buying Q1, that many consumers are paying that much more. So this rectangle here, so I could call this A, B, and C. So P1, E1, BP is so sometimes you can shade it, or you can just write it in your paragraph brackets P1, E1, BP, but I'll just sort of write over it for now for you to see. This area here is the consumer burden, because they were paying price P and now they're paying price P1. That's the easy one to think about. Now let's think about the producer burden. Well, it must be whatever's left of this rectangle, but the reason that it should make sense to you is they were receiving price P. Then the price went up to P1, but when you take away the unit tax from that, they're only actually getting A. So they were at P1, some of them just stopped producing, but of the ones left, they were receiving P1, now they're only receiving A. So they've lost, of the producers that are still producing, that didn't go and produce something else, they've lost this much money. So this is the producer burden, okay? I'm shading it in like this. Sometimes you can just label in your paragraph that you would write next to it, you would say, and the consumer burden is P1, E1, BP. the producer burden is PBCA. Okay, so let's just do it one more time in the ad valorem tax. For the ad valorem tax, I'll do it the other way around now, just so you can really think about the producer burden. The producer was receiving price P, but now they're getting P1, but when they take away the tax per unit, they're actually only receiving, a revenue of this much. Let's just call that A. So they were receiving this much, now they're receiving this much. So the distance, the vertical distance there, that's the producer burden. That's the producer burden, this area here. On the other hand, the consumers were paying this much, now they're paying this much. And remember, it's only times the new quantity because some producers and consumers have left the market. They were paying this much, now they're paying this much times that quantity. So this area here represents the consumer burden. Okay? Check that you can draw those two. Watch some of the other videos that I'm going to upload from other people on YouTube, but I wanted to explain it once to you in my own words. And then for your final task, what I'd like you to do, once you're really happy with drawing those from memory, I'd like you to have a go at drawing each of these, but I want you to try each of them once where demand is relatively elastic. So your demand curve is a bit more like that. And then try it once where demand is relatively inelastic. Maybe you want to predict it before, but don't worry if you can't. But I want you to see if you can predict it. What happens? Who pays a bigger chunk of this tax revenue? The consumer or the producer? Who is more out of pocket? Who ends up paying more of the tax when demand is elastic versus when demand is inelastic? Think about what elasticity of demand means. Who's going to end up forking out more of that tax money? And have a go at drawing each and see what you find. And next week, we'll go through all of this and we'll see what you understand, what you don't understand, and we'll see if you manage to get this far. Okay? Yep. Have a nice day.